Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, chapter 9, halacha 5, and the art scroll we're on 82b3. The Mishnah is very short, the Gemara is very short, but this halacha is really a gem. There's a lot in here. One of the key ideas that's going to come up in the Mishnah is going to be what happens if you wear shatnez. And first of all, how did they get the word shatnez? It's going to go through the etymology of the word. And then also what happens to you if you do wear it. It's serious. And the Gemaras I thought were really interesting because it's dealing with the differences between the combinations of wool and linen and what's going to be prohibited and what's not. I thought that it was really interesting. So the Mishnah starts off and says that a fabric is not forbidden because of Kilayim unless it is made of wool and linen threads that are spun and woven. Now, the Vilna Goan makes a very good insight here in the Shatnez Eliyahu. He's saying that the threads must have been spun out of a mixture of wool and linen fibers and then woven into the garment. Why is that an issue, right? Well, if I made a rope, let's say for a boat, and I'm not going to wear it, well, that's not forbidden, right? You can do that. The key that the Vilna Goan is saying is that they're spun this way, they've been connected together, and now they're woven into something that you can wear or that comes onto you. That's going to be the issue. Now, there's certain things here that we might not have known if we didn't go through the Mishnah, and we're going to get into that. So the Mishnah continues and it says, it is stated, you shall not wear shatnez. And the Hebrew word for shatnez is a combination of three words teaching that the prohibition applies to something that is combined through being smooth, that's going to be shua, spun, that's going to be tavoy, and woven, nose. So the combination of those three manufacturing processes is put together, and that is how we get it. So if wool and linen, which by the way is in Devarim 22:11, is going to be combined through any one of these three processes, it's going to be biblical shatnez. And so the Rambam in his commentary on the Mishnah is saying that the Mishnah began by stating that wool and linen is spun together into thread. That's going to be tavoy, and that's going to constitute biblical shatnez. And the Mishnah is adding that if they were then woven into a garment, not because the thread in itself does not constitute shatnez unless it is woven, for in fact, a wool and linen thread produced through spinning does constitute shatnez. However, in order for one to actually transgress the prohibition, the threads must be made into a garment. And if he merely places the thread on himself, he's not transgressed the shatnez prohibition. So says the Vilna Goan that the Mishnah is stating that the fabric was spun and woven, and so what we would see here is that we're dealing with maybe rabbinic shatnez, and then we're dealing with biblical level shatnez. That's going to be the insight by the Vilna Goan. And so one of the other ideas is we're learning certain things that we might not have known before. For instance, smoothing. So what is going to be smoothing? Well, it's like how you make a black hat. You take wool and you put a lot of heat and pressure and you press it together and you can make felt. And what they could do with fabrics and materials is you can layer them. So what happens if you have on one side you're making felt and in the middle there's a piece of canvas made out of linen and then another piece of felt, and you've pressed this into making something like for a shoe. Well, you didn't just layer one thing on top of it. You've connected it now. You've formed it together, and now that it's been formed together and connected, that's going to make biblical shatnez. That's going to be the idea. So if you just said, well, it's just going to be spinning and weaving, that's going to be the issue, you wouldn't be able to figure out that smoothing is also going to be a problem. Here's where we get into what happens when you're actually going to be doing the sin of shatnez. And the Mishnah says that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that he who wears shatnez distances, that's going to be naloz, himself from the proper path and causes his Father in heaven to distance. That's going to be meliz, his mercy from him. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, according to the Rosh Cirilio, is understanding this as a compound word to be, for Shatnez to be noloz, and even though there's no lamed in that phrase, we can still understand nos to be an acronym for naloz, and we're to understand that when you're doing the sin of Shatnez, when we read in Berachot, it's dealing with mercy, right? The prayers are an appeal for divine mercy. That's what we learn in Berachot. And what is he saying over here? He's saying that he causes his Father in heaven to distance his mercy from him. So that means, says the Vilna Goan, that when you're wearing Shatnez, while you're wearing the Shatnez, that your prayers will not be answered. You've distanced yourself. Now, why is that? Why would that be such a big problem? And what's going to be the issue? Like, what's the big deal? And the Rambam gives an amazing explanation about this that I didn't understand until I read the Rambam. The Rambam explains that Shatnez is the kind of sin that you're just doing it just to do it. Okay, he explains that, if you're going to have a juicy piece of forbidden fat, it tastes good. Or maybe you have something like a taste for treif, and you just really desire it, right? Well, you're getting some sort of satisfaction out of it. Or let's say you're getting some sort of perverted sex crime. Well, that person, while doing something horrible, is getting some sort of pleasure or satisfaction out of it, even though it's warped and twisted and wrong. And even when the person, is doing some other act, like eating like treifa or something, like a nice big treif steak, that it wasn't shechted right. He's eating treif, he's eating nevela, but he's getting pleasure out of it. They cooked it in butter and it's juicy and nice. It's wrong, right? It's not what a Jew's supposed to do, but the guy's getting pleasure out of it. What the Rambam says about what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is pointing out is that this garment, okay, that you have Shatnez in the garment, it doesn't give you any pleasure. It doesn't give you any added beauty to the garment, says the Rambam. It doesn't give you any added warmth, says the Rambam. It doesn't look any better. It looks exactly the same. In other words, you're not getting any pleasure out of it. You're not getting anything better out of this garment than that garment. It's exactly the same. And this guy, who the Rambam says decides to keep the Shatnez instead of getting rid of it and doing what the Jew's supposed to do, the reason that he distances himself from the proper path and causes Hashem to not listen to his prayers, as the Vilna Goan is saying, of what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is saying, is because you've thrown off the yoke of Torah. You've rebelled, says the Rambam. The Rambam is explaining that the purposeful act of dafka wearing Shatnez is that you've rebelled against the Torah, the mitzvot, Har Sinai. And that's the deeper point. And that's why his mercy is distanced from you. Measure for measure, you yourself are throwing off the yoke of Torah. And measure for measure, Hashem is not going to respond to you in the ways of the blessings. Now, Hashem's plan is always going to be carried out. But in our life, we can decide whether we're going to be a tzaddik and we're going to go in the way of Hashem and follow all of the laws, including Shatnez and the proper path, or we could be a rasha. And if we're going to be a tzaddik, it says that we're going to get rewarded for it. But if we're going to be a rasha, we're going to be punished for it. And that's what we can see in the differences between Mordechai and Haman in the Purim story. In the Purim story, the word Purim means lots. It's related to lots. It looks like this is all coincidence. And it's not. And this is the key idea, because just as Mordechai is an agent for carrying out Hashem's plan to get the Jews back into doing Torah and mitzvot while they are in exile, so too Haman is also, even though a Rasha, carrying out Hashem's plan. And one is going to be rewarded, one is going to be punished, but you can choose what you're going to do, whether you're going to go in the proper path of Hashem or not. You will be either rewarded or punished, but nonetheless, Hashem's plan will still be carried out. You will still be a shliach if you go in the proper path, and you're a tzaddik, and you'll be rewarded for it. But if you decide to try to go against Hashem and to be an Erev Rav and things like that, you are still going to carry out Hashem's plan. But you are going to be a shliach that is going to be punished. And so when you decided to go away from the proper path, Hashem is going to put less divine providence on you. You will pull down less light from the sfirot. You'll be further from the God in heaven. And the way the universe will work for you will be one where it's engendering curses instead of blessing. Now, the Mishnah taught that shua and nose are going to be how the word for Shatnez is put together. And it says that felts made of wool and linen fibers are forbidden because they are smoothed together. Again, we wouldn't know this if we didn't have this in the Mishnah. So far, we would have just thought that Shatnez is going to be things that are woven and spun. But no, pressing them together is also going to be. Now, if you open up a sneaker, you can see that in the base of the sneaker that the fibers are put together in layers and pressed. And it's done with a lot of steam and heat and pressure. And it's basically formed into a single thing. Now, they can also use stitches as well. But we wouldn't have known this. And, this is going to be forbidden. Why? Because they've effectively been connected. That's going to be the key idea, is that if you've created something that now is fastened together with these forbidden materials, it's going to be a problem. Mishnah continues and says, a rope of wool that is going to be twined with a rope of linen is forbidden to be used as a belt because they resemble the weave of wool and linen. Now, what's this about the belt? So the Rambam is saying that wool and linen were twined. So it's not really woven together. And the idea about a weave is that since weaving is one of the processes that makes doraita Shatnez, then the process that's being done to these ropes is resembling it. And so that too, says the Pnei Moshe, constitutes Shatnez. So according to this explanation, if you're having a belt, it's going to constitute Shatnez because it was actually woven together and now it's being put onto you as a garment. That's going to be the problem. Now, the Mishnah is citing this case as the last case, and although the wool and linen are not combined or spun together, this belt is still going to constitute biblical Shatnez because the wool and linen are woven together. In other words, imagine like it's braided. In other words, it's not spun together, but really it's like braided together. And effectively you fastened it together, and that's going to be a problem. The Mishnah teaches another application of the Shatnez laws, that Rabbi Yossi says that belts of purple wool are forbidden to be worn over a linen garment. What is that? Well, Pnei Moshe is going to explain it. He's going to say that it's a rope-like belt of purple wool that is tied around a rope. In other words, that they're fastening it together, and it's teaching that you can't tie around a linen rope, and then the problem is that if you have it where it's going to be sewn, then you're going to have an issue. Okay, so that you might have one material inside of another. Okay, imagine you have like a pipe, and the pipe is going to be like this purple wool, and then inside you have a cord to hold it together, and that's going to be what gives it body, and that's going to be made out of linen. Well, that's going to be what the issue is, and that's what we're talking about. So Rabbi Yossi says a belt of purple wool is forbidden to be worn over a linen garment because he tacks them on the linen garment before tying them around his body. In other words, where does this become a problem? If you're putting one over the other, it's not a problem. The problem comes when you fasten it together. In other words, you now have this wool, purple wool, beautiful exterior, and to hold it together, you have this linen cord to give it body. But what you did in the garment is you sewed the two pieces together into the garment to connect it. That's going to be a problem. But if you just only tied this around into a not permanent knot, in other words, into a knot that's known to be undone, it's not fastened through, it's not connected through one another, that's going to be okay. And just to tie it around the body is fine. The problem comes when you've now connected these two things together to tack them into the garment. That's where it's going to become a problem. Even if the tack is just one thread of linen or wool, that's going to be a problem. Well, actually, we're going to get into another issue that could be another problem with tacking it together. And it says that one may not tie a strip of wool to a strip of linen to gird his waist, even though the leather strap is in the middle. So what this is now saying is, well, what happens if you have this linen cord and you have the purple wool on the outside, and to tack this onto the garment, you're using a little piece of leather sinew to sew it in. Well, that's now a problem. Why? Yeah, you didn't use linen or wool as the thread to tie it. You used something else. You used a leather strap, or you used a piece of sinew, and that's going to be the connector. But this problem still exists. Why? Because what you've tacked together is you made a combination now of linen and wool, and that's going to be what the problem is. Even though you used a different material. And this, by the way, gets into modern manufacture, because in modern manufacture, they're using a lot of synthetic materials, and that's still going to be the case. So if you now have a panel of linen and a panel of wool, and you use synthetic fibers to sew these two together, then you've formed together a cohesive thing. It's going to be a lot like smoothing. And so you have one panel layered on top of the other that you've connected. And yeah, it's connected together with the synthetic fiber, but you've still formed it together. That's going to be a problem. So the Mishnah continues, and it says that the labels of weavers and the labels of launderers are forbidden as Kilayim. That, I think, is beautiful. Why is that? Well, because when you take your clothes to the laundry, this person is sewing in a tag to identify the garment. You know it's going to come out. It's just a temporary thing. It's not a permanent fixture to improve the product. It's just so that the launderer or the weaver who's making a repair on something can identify, this belongs to Mr. X, and here's your garment back. And it's just a little tag that you know is temporary. And that's going to be forbidden as Kilayim. In other words, that you have to take this little tag out, and then you can wear it. But while it's there, you can't wear it, you can't let it come onto you. So what are we learning from this Mishnah here? We're learning that even temporary structures that you fixed into the garment, like the label of a launderer, is going to be forbidden. Even though it's on for a short time, even though it's temporary, it's still connected together, they still sewed it in, and it's still going to be a problem. Very, very interesting stuff. Now, the Mishnah talked about how we're getting the term for Shatnez, and that it's a combination of three different words that are put together. And it's demonstrating the processes of manufacturing for combining wool and linen. Now, the Gemara is going to wonder why the Mishnah has to demonstrate all three processes. And I think that this is really a very key idea, a very beautiful idea. In other words, the idea that's going to be coming up is that without wool and linen being spun together or woven together, we wouldn't know that smoothing is going to be an issue. In other words, we wouldn't have any way to figure out this other kind of process, like how you're going to make felts, where you're going to take high heat and steam and pressure. You're going to press these things together. You're going to press many panels together to form a cohesive unit. You wouldn't know that without this Mishnah saying it. So the Gemara says, let the Mishnah teach only that the combination of wool and linen through smoothing produces biblical Shatnez, and not teach that combining it through spinning produces biblical Shatnez. In other words, the question is, why, when we're coming up with this combination of words where it says shua, tavoy, and nose, why is it teaching all three processes? Why not just say that, hey, we're dealing with felts and not just say, smoothing alone? And why are we saying that, spinning could produce biblical shatnez? Or why are we saying that weaving can? Why, in other words, why then is it necessary for the Mishnah to teach explicitly that spinning alone is going to produce biblical shatnez? And the Gemara is going to respond. It's going to say, if we had learned only that smoothing produces biblical shatnez and not spinning, we would have said that it is only spun. If it's only spun, it's permitted. And it's not true because the Mishnah didn't teach it. Gemara says, rather, a fabric is not forbidden for Kilayim unless it is spun and woven. In other words, what this is trying to say is that spinning wool and linen threads together produces biblical shatnez, even if it's not smooth. And a law we wouldn't have known if the Mishnah didn't teach it explicitly. So the reason to differentiate between spinning and smoothing is so that if the Mishnah didn't teach it explicitly regarding biblical shatnez, we might have mistakenly thought that it does not produce biblical shatnez. So to avoid us coming up with this conclusion, the Mishnah is teaching explicitly that even just spinning alone is going to produce biblical shatnez. In other words, even just spinning these things together. Now, the Vilna Goan says about this in Shenis Eliyahu that the fact of the weaving process produces biblical shatnez should also be derived from the fact that the smoothing process also does so. So the Gemara continues and says, let the Mishnah teach only that the smoothing process produces biblical shatnez and not teach that the weaving process produces biblical shatnez. In other words, that you need to have all three of them in there because all three of them can produce the biblical shatnez. And you might not have known that if you were just looking at one of these. In other words, if you left one out, you might have said, well, that one doesn't produce biblical shatnez, only this one does. And the Gemara is going to explain more about this. It says, if we learned only that the smoothing process produces biblical shatnez and not the weaving, we would have said that if it's combined only through weaving, it's permitted. And that too is not true because our Mishnah didn't teach it. Rather, we're teaching is a rope that's twined with a rope of linen is forbidden to use as a belt because it resembles a weave of wool and linen. In other words, you took a cord that is totally going to be linen, and a cord that is totally going to be wool, and you braided these together. That's going to be what we're talking about, this weave. And we're not talking about where you have a loom and you're taking the up and down fibers to be linen and the left and right fibers on your weave to be wool. We're not talking about that. We are talking about something that is now braided together. That's going to be connected. And this is teaching that combining wool and linen only through a weaving process produces biblical shatnez. And we wouldn't have known that law if it wasn't for this Mishnah teaching so explicitly. In other words, what this is trying to teach is that the Mishnah had to state all three, because if you only stated two of them, you wouldn't be able to get the third one. In other words, you would have said that, oh, well, in this case, the third one is going to be maybe rabbinical shatnez, or maybe it's not shatnez. And in fact, it is biblical shatnez. And that's going to be the insight by the Vilna Goan to help explain why all three are necessary to be stated. Now, the last process is going to be talked about. It says, let the Mishnah teach only that the combining of wool and linen through weaving is going to produce biblical shatnez. In other words, why are we teaching that smoothing is going to produce biblical shatnez? And the Gemara answers, and it says that if we learned only that the weaving produces biblical shatnez and not smoothing, we would have said that if the wool and the linen were only smooth, it's going to be permitted. And that's not true because our Mishnah didn't teach it, but rather felts are forbidden because they are smooth. So this is teaching that if you've combined wool and linen through this smoothing process, that you're pressing these panels together, you're going to produce biblical shatnez. And this is a law that we wouldn't have known unless the Mishnah stated so explicitly. So in other words, regarding all three of these, with the spinning or with the weaving or with the smoothing, unless it stated explicitly, we just wouldn't have known it. And the Mishnah talked about the belts of purple wool and that they're forbidden to wear over linen. And the Gemara says there's a Tana who teaches that it is permitted. And the Gemara analyzes the discrepancy. It says the ones who say that it is forbidden refers to a case of those weavers, in which case the belt is attached to the garments. On the other hand, the one who says that it's permitted refers to where the belts are not attached to the garment, but are worn by connecting the straps together. And since it is only the straps of the belt that cause it to be attached to the garment underneath, it's also going to lower the belt without undoing the straps. Let me explain. This is saying, well, maybe there's a contradiction, right? Maybe when we're talking about the belts of purple and linen, purple wool and linen cords that are together, maybe there's a case of these weavers in a brisa where they had it permitted. So why is this Mishnah teaching that it's forbidden? Why is it? Because in the case of the weavers, they weren't fixing it to the garment. They only wore this kind of wool exterior with a linen cord belt to tie it together, and it was with a not permanent knot, right? They would tie a little knot around to hold their pants up, and they didn't fix this cord as into the garment itself. They didn't tack it in. So that's going to be permitted because, again, you're allowed to wear a wool coat over a linen jacket. That's fine. The problem comes when you now start connecting these things together. That's going to be the problem. So in the case the Mishnah is talking about, we're talking about where you've tacked these now together into the garment. That's going to be a problem. But in the case of these weavers, that's allowed. That's permitted. Why? Because you didn't make it a permanent fixture to the garment. You didn't connect it to the garment. And that's going to be the resolution. There's no contradiction at all. And then we are going to get into Halacha 6, which ends up dealing with things with Tuma. And it finishes up the Gemara. Have a great day.